The year is 1992. A 26-year-old musician paces around his studio, working on his next musical project. He does this in secret because he is a signed musician who works for a label that wants him to create a light, digestible project for the masses. Instead, he does the opposite, making the darkest sound that he can possibly conceive, bouncing from studio to studio, working under pseudonyms so that the label doesn't find out what he's doing. And after carefully crafting 6 dark, intense tracks, he gets to work on a collection of music videos. He teams up with a director that can help him see his vision, and together, they create a 20-minute musical short film that has gone down in history as one of the most disturbing pieces of media ever made. It was ultimately shelved, being deemed too disturbing to watch, but eventually it was leaked, and today we have access to the entire thing, and after watching it myself, I can tell you that this is not a video for the faint of heart. It is a product of frustration, an expression of rage, and a middle finger from a man who truly loathed the industry that he was in. That man was none other than Trent Reznor. The musical project in question was for his band 9 Inch Nails, and the video that we are going to be talking about today was simply titled Broken. But first, an explanation. Trent Reznor was always a little bit different. He was born in 1965 in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, a town with around 40,000 people. He was raised by his maternal grandparents, who described him as a creative but introverted kid. He was a child who immediately disliked the boundaries that he was placed in, a small town where nothing happened. His only escape was the media that he consumed. My life experience came from watching movies, watching TV, and reading books. When your culture comes from watching television every day, you're bombarded with images of things that seem cool, places that seem interesting, people who have jobs and careers and opportunities. None of that happened where I was. You're almost taught to realize it's not for you. Creating music, on the other hand, was for him. From the age of 5, he was playing piano. In high school, he picked up the saxophone, and by the time he was in his early 20s, he was playing in numerous different bands. Groups like Option, The Innocent, and Exotic Birds, where he played the keyboard and performed vocals. It seemed like he was doing anything to break away from the monotony that he hated so much. The rule set that he didn't want to follow could only be broken if he found some kind of success in his musical endeavors. In 1988, he was working as a janitor for Right Track Studios. The owner of the building, Bart Coster, allowed him to record there for free, and this is where he began to truly find his footing in music. He wasn't able to find bandmates who could help him create the sound that he wanted to make, but luckily he didn't need any bandmates. He had learned enough instruments at this stage, and he was able to do it by himself. He meticulously crafted every single part of every single song. The only instrument he didn't actually play was the drums, which he would program in. He first created a 12-inch demo that attracted the attention of a label, TVT Records, who took many of the songs he had already recorded for an unreleased project called Pure as Feeling and revised them into a new project, Pretty Hate Machine. The album was released under the name 9 Inch Nails. Reznor said there was no particular reason for picking this name, it just had a nice ring to it and it was easy to abbreviate. Well, maybe it was the name or maybe it was the actual music, but the album was a moderate success. It charted at number 75 on the Billboard Top 200, and it received very positive reviews from critics, who praised the album for its elements of synth pop, the catchy riffs, and the production that not only came from Reznor, but also came from producers like Flood, Keith LeBlanc, Adrian Sherwood, and John Fryer. The album's 10 tracks were not only well received, but they were enough to take 9 Inch Nails on tour. Reznor compiled a group of bandmates and hit the road. The Pretty Hate Machine tour was in full effect, and I mean that in every sense. In '88, they opened for the band Skinny Puppy. In '89, they went on their own promotional tour. In 1990, they opened for the Jesus and Mary Chain, and then again for Peter Murphy. After that, they went on the Hate Tour and the Sin Tour, then Lollapalooza, and then a European tour. This set of shows lasted years, tour after tour after tour. It seemed like it would never end, a cycle that Trent Reznor had reluctantly stepped into. He left one matrix and entered another, one contractual obligation after the next. It was non-stop.
And I thought that maybe when I reached all these goals, I'd find some sort of peace. And I didn't. You know, it's like I'm more miserable now than I ever was.
By all accounts, his label was satisfied. This is what they wanted, and if anything, they wanted more. In the early 90s, TVT Records asked Trent Reznor to make a new 9 Inch Nails album, one that sounded similar to Pretty Hate Machine, but even lighter and more digestible. They wanted to fully capitalize off a sound that Trent Reznor was now reluctant to make. He had just spent 3 years touring this exact album and wanted to make a different type of record, but TVT wanted him to be more commercial, more accessible, and create a full-blown synth-pop record. It was a war of ideas, and it pushed Reznor to a place where he wanted to make a project that was darker than anything he had ever made, and that's exactly what he did. Trent Reznor took the money that he had made from touring and decided to invest it into a new project, one that his label had no idea he was making. He secretly jumped around different studios with various different producers and started to formulate an entirely new project, a 6-track EP called Broken, which actually ended up being 8 songs after all was said and done. This EP sounded completely different to anything that he had ever released. The instrumentals were harsher than ever before, the lyrics were gritty and to the point, and the overall vibe of the project was the exact opposite of what the label wanted. There was no way that they were going to approve it. Steve Gottlieb, the owner and founder of TVT Records, borderline hated Trent Reznor at this point, and the feeling was seemingly mutual. It looked like Reznor's future projects were going to be shelved and he would be ostracized from the music industry for being hard to work with. But little did he know, there was a man in the background who was watching all of this unfold, and he was waiting for the right moment to swoop in. This man was Jimmy Iovine, who first heard 9 Inch Nails in 1991 and was interested in signing Trent Reznor to his newfound label, Interscope Records. The problem was that 9 Inch Nails were signed to a 7-album deal, and even if Jimmy Iovine could convince Steve Gottlieb to let 9 Inch Nails go, he would then have to convince Trent Reznor to sign a completely new deal, and at this stage, Reznor wanted absolutely nothing to do with record companies at all. It was going to be very difficult to negotiate such a complicated deal, but Jimmy Iovine threw everything at the wall, and for around a year, he called every single party involved every single day. Reznor, Gottlieb, the lawyers, anybody who had anything to do with getting this deal done was contacted by Iovine every single day. He heard every side, came up with solutions, and finally managed to draft a contract that somewhat satisfied all parties involved. The idea was this: buy out the original contract, create a new deal for 1 album, and then create an exclusive contract for 9 Inch Nails after the initial deal was done. Essentially, TVT and Interscope were going to come together for the next album, but TVT would have very little control. After that, Trent Reznor and Steve Gottlieb would go their separate ways. Like I said, very complicated deal, but it got done, and finally, Jimmy Iovine and Trent Reznor met in person to discuss the future. Reznor was understandably skeptical and wanted to test this so-called freedom that Jimmy Iovine was offering at Interscope. First, he asked for complete creative control. No oversight, no orders, he would just make the music and give it to the label, and that was it. Jimmy Iovine said yes. Then, Reznor asked for his own label so that he could sign any artist that he wanted to work with. Again, Jimmy Iovine said yes. Reznor was pleasantly surprised, and in response to this, he gave Interscope Records the project he had been working on in secret, the Broken EP. A lot of people might not know this, but this EP was actually a lifesaver to Interscope Records. The label was essentially hemorrhaging money in 1992, and this project, and the fact that they had just successfully signed 9 Inch Nails, was a huge turning point for the company. So even though it may seem like a small EP made out of rage and anger, it actually has a very significant place in music history. But of course, there is another reason why this EP became notorious. Like I said, Reznor wanted to test his newfound freedom, and although he was satisfied with the conversation that he had just had with Jimmy Iovine, he was not totally convinced, and in 1993, he set out to create something that would truly test the boundaries of his creative liberties and artistic expression in general. Because what is a better way to test how far you can go than making one of the most disturbing pieces of media that anybody has ever seen? Trent Reznor teamed up with filmmaker John Reese to create the Happiness in Slavery music video. This was a pretty grotesque video that we'll discuss in full later, but for now I will simply say that it was very intense, and there was no way that this could be aired on a station like MTV, or really any television station at all. Reznor was not only okay with this, but he wanted to make something even darker, something that would truly prove how much of a wild card he was to work with, and possibly deter labels from wanting to work with him in any capacity. He hired Peter Christopherson to help him with this, and together, they started to conceptualize a 20-minute short film simply titled The Broken Movie, which would be a collection of 5 music videos based on music from the EP. They sat down and had a conversation about the project, and Reznor said the following about their discussion in an interview. He said, There was no label involvement or pressure from anyone. It was just he and I talking. What if we built up a framework around these songs? What if we took an approach where it was really scary, instead of a cop-out horror movie nod to the camera? What if it felt real? And that's exactly what they did. The video is done in 5 acts, and it goes as follows. The video begins, and we see a man in handcuffs being executed. We're not sure why he's here or what he has done, but clearly it was enough to warrant the death penalty. We then see shots of what looks like a suburban estate with ominous music playing in the background. This happens for around 30 seconds, until we see a man walk towards the camera in a confused state. It quickly cuts to a much darker place, an eerie looking basement that has a single chair in the middle of it. In that chair is the man that we just saw, and a masked person who circles around him. It's evident that he has just been kidnapped. Instead of torturing him, the masked man walks towards a small television, picks up a remote, and begins to play a video. I can't actually show you the full thing, and that will be a reoccurring trend here. But the video shows a recreation of somebody being essentially drowned by what we can only hope is water. That is the first thing that the kidnapper shows to his victim, and as dark as that is, it is only the beginning. After the first video plays, a new one begins, and it's the music video for the song Wish. The video shows the band performing the track in the middle of a steel cage that is surrounded by a chaotic group of fans. Throughout the 3-minute performance, the audience are getting more and more rowdy, and near the end of the song, they start attempting to break into the cage in an attempt to get to the band. They eventually succeed in this endeavor, and the video ends abruptly. The last scene shows us the crowd now in the cage running towards the band. It cuts back to the torturer's basement, and he rewinds a certain part of the music video over and over again, which is actually Trent Reznor singing a certain lyric of the song. That interesting clip concludes the second video, and although it's hard to imagine, the movie starts to take an even stranger turn from here. Help Me, I Am in Hell is the next song that plays, and we get a rather fitting video for a pretty intense track. The video shows us a man staring intensely at the camera as flies swarm around him. He then attempts to have a steak and wine dinner, but for obvious reasons, he struggles. The video occasionally cuts to the same man in bondage, and after a couple of minutes, the video ends. And honestly, I can sort of see the method to the madness when it comes to most of these videos, but this one is definitely a head scratcher. After this video, we go back to the torturer's basement and see one of the most brutal scenes of the entire movie, when the torturer literally tears his victim's teeth out. It is a tough watch to say the least, and I obviously can't show you the entire clip, but trust me, that is for the best. Act 4 begins, and we see Trent Reznor locked in a cage screaming the words to happiness in slavery. A very fitting title considering the video we are about to discuss. A man in a suit walks into a dark, desolate room and lights a candle. He then lies down on what seems to be a surgical bed. At this point, various different clamps and spikes start to attack the man's body, and slowly but surely, they rip him apart until he eventually dies. His body is then put through some sort of meat churner and turned into some kind of mush. After this grueling process, Trent Reznor himself walks into the same room and picks up a candle, insinuating that this is some kind of sick process that these people are being forced to go through, and that this will not be the last time somebody dies in such a devastating fashion. This was the music video I referred to earlier, and it was essentially the reason that this movie exists. And when I watched it at first, I was intrigued to say the least. There's literally no way that this video could air on any station, and yet the effects, the acting, and the general effort in this video are commendable. It's well shot, well produced, and well edited, which is fascinating when you consider that it's almost unusable from a marketing point of view. That is a running theme in this movie that I think deserves some level of respect, but I'll talk about that more later, because we do still have one more act to get through, the final chapter of this insane movie. The final act begins, and we get a clip of a fridge filled with some interesting looking meat and the head from the first music video. It then cuts to the torturer attacking his victim. Up until now, most of these clips have been slow and short, but these clips are spliced together in quick succession, and the song that's playing, Gave Up, is a fast-paced track that fits the scene perfectly. A police officer then walks into the house to investigate the scene and immediately covers his mouth because of the stench. From here, the video cuts from the torture back to the police officer in the house. It's interesting to note that these scenes are some of the best looking videos in the whole movie, while the footage from the torturer's basement is grainier than ever before. These clips are quickly cut side by side, which makes for an interesting juxtaposition. When the killer is finally finished with his victim, we see one last clip of him basking in his work, and then finally, the video ends. It cuts to one last shot, the clip that we saw at the beginning, the execution. All of the videos that the man showed to his victim were made by him. He was essentially showing off the cruel ways that he had killed his prey before eventually taking another life. This was most likely his last victim before he himself was finally killed. I have covered a lot of disturbing media on this channel, but this specific movie has some of the darkest, grittiest footage I have ever seen, and I honestly look forward to the day that it is wiped from my memory. I mentioned this a little bit already, but one of the most interesting parts about this project is how unsalvageable it is from a promotional point of view. While a couple of the shorter videos at the beginning were released in a limited fashion, the second half of this movie was never released in any capacity. Simply put, it would have been so censored to the point that it would essentially be a completely different video. The reason I said that this deserves some level of respect is because this was the early 90s. The internet was not a widely used promotional tool, so even trying to market this movie through the lens of morbid curiosity was virtually impossible. This was simply a hindrance to the career of Trent Reznor, who actually stopped any release from happening himself because of how intense it turned out. We didn't know it would look so real. At the time, we felt releasing it would cause an uproar of attention that would overshadow what I was trying to do musically. How real it looked was actually a genuine concern at the time. Reznor later said that he was worried people would believe this was an authentic snuff film. And while that may seem a little silly today, this was made 30 years ago. I can only imagine stumbling onto a cassette tape and seeing this film on it, not knowing what it is, especially if it was cut up in a certain way. It truly was a dangerous piece of footage at the time, and I can fully understand why it was never given an official release. Reznor actually did make an alternative visual for the song Gave Up, which was a simple enough performance video featuring Marilyn Manson that he recorded at the house he was living in at the time. That house was actually the residence that Sharon Tate lived in when she was killed by Charles Manson's cult. Even though this is an edgy premise for a music video, it doesn't even come close to the visuals that we see in the Broken movie, and to this date, it's the most disturbing thing that Trent Reznor has ever made, and it's unlikely to change. 9 Inch Nails' next album after this was The Downward Spiral in 1994. This was a huge commercial success, debuting at number 2 on the Billboard Top 200 and truly establishing 9 Inch Nails as one of the biggest bands of the 1990s. To this day, many fans consider this album to be Trent Reznor's best work, and unsurprisingly, it was also a dark, disturbing, distorted project. When you put this all together and you realize that the Broken EP, the movie, and this album were all made in the space of roughly 2 years, you start to see the kind of headspace that Reznor was in at the time. It truly was a manic and chaotic period of his life, and artistically, these projects were the result. 9 Inch Nails are easily the most commercially successful band or musical act I have ever covered on this series, and for that reason, I don't really feel the need to delve deep into the rest of their career. 20 million albums sold, multiple top 5 records, and to top it off, Atticus Ross and Trent Reznor have teamed up multiple times to score various different movies, like Mid-90s, Gone Girl, and my favorite movie soundtrack of all time, The Social Network, which they actually won an Academy Award for. That's just the footnotes, but like I said, it's all very well documented, and that's not really what the point of this series is, so I'll just leave that there. At this point, I would usually tell you to go check out the material I was talking about, but for obvious reasons, I can't do that, so I'll just recommend the Broken EP. It's a solid piece of work, and it's definitely worth a listen. 2 of the songs even went on to win Grammys, and the project was well respected by critics. I wonder how many of them knew that right behind that project was one of the darkest short movies ever made, living eerily in the shadows. And to be perfectly honest, after dissecting it this much, I think that might be just where it belongs.